So I think the problem with eviction in Nebraska and really nationally has been there forever, mainly because of the imbalance in power. And what we saw with the pandemic is it really just highlighted all of these imbalances.
A lot of folks are just not making the income necessary to keep up with all that life requires of you.
I don't feel as if it's just behavior to evict people who are going through a hardship.
In this climate of social injustice, we really need to push for policy change. And those that are most affected, they don't have a voice around it.
We all benefit from when people have a place to be and live and exist that helps them live a fruitful and productive life. And right now, it's a matter of selection and happenstance, luck, and privilege. And we have all of the tools available to us to address that inequity.
Hello, my name is Kathy Ermacher. I am the chair of the Commission on Women and Gender here in Lincoln. And as part of our Women in COVID series, today our topic is evictions. We know that many women lost their jobs or lost some parts of their employment due to the pandemic. And we really wanted to have a chance to focus on one of the resulting issues of that, and that is evictions or the threat of evictions from housing. So today we are going to be talking about women in COVID, and the topic is evictions. Today joining me is Gabriella Parsons. Gabriella is the director and filmmaker of a film called Behind on Rent, and we're going to be talking about that today. Also, we're joined by Lori Heerdale, who is the director of the Nebraska State Bar Association's Volunteer Lawyers Project. Welcome, Lori. And also by Mindy Rush Chipman. Mindy is the director of the Human Rights Commission here in the city of Lincoln. And then finally, Isabel Salas, who is the director of community engagement with the South of Downtown Community Development Organization. So I welcome all of you and thank you all so much for being with us today, talking about this super important topic. First of all, let's just talk about some statistics. What are some statistics? How many people, women and men, but how many people are being affected by this eviction crisis in our community?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kathy. Before I start, I'm going to give you a basic caveat here. So there is no publicly available database with these figures on them. We have to rely on our Nebraska court system to provide this data. And they always provide a caveat that there is a slight margin of error in their data. And so I'm going to follow along and provide that same caveat because I've relied primarily on their data. But looking across the state of Nebraska, there are approximately 9,000 eviction cases filed annually. And in 2020, due to the pandemic, we saw a decrease there of about 33%. And primarily looking at the data, we would say those decreases occurred in March, April, and May when the governor issued an executive order. And then again, since September, so September through December, due to the CDC moratorium, which is still in effect today. So that's statewide. Then if you look at Lancaster County in general, in Lancaster County every year, there are 1,500 eviction cases filed. And we saw about the same decrease in 2020, about a 33% decrease, obviously for the same reasons when you look at the data. Overall, though, I want to say with respect to evictions statewide, there was a decrease in evictions statewide by about 40% last year as compared to 2019. In Lancaster County, that decrease was a little more. It was about 45% in comparison to 2019. And we, obviously fewer cases filed, but we also believe that the presence of TAP provided or helped in that decrease. I do want to share a few statistics we have too about the impact on people of color and women. And I know that you're probably going to be talking later in the show about that, Kathy. But with respect to people of color and women, yes, there is a disproportionate impact. The data that I have, we are relying generally on data that we've collected through, combined sources, not necessarily just data through the court system. So I want to provide that caveat. Across the state, about 52% of the filings include people of color. And then in Lancaster County alone, it's about 37%. And then with respect to women statewide, it's about 70% of filings overall and about 64% in Lancaster County.
Okay, thank you. Let's just explain to our viewers, when you say the decrease, a lot of people would like perk up and say, wait a minute, decrease? I thought there were a lot of increases in evictions. So why are you saying that there are some decrease, and could you explain the moratorium a little bit so that people know what that was?
Sure. So I think overall, when you look at the decrease, given the fact that we had the governor issuing an executive order and then the CDC, the Center for Disease and Control, coming in and setting a moratorium, and you're looking at, it's more than 6 months out of the year, one would think that decrease would have been larger than 33%, right? But it was only about 33% across the state, and true in Lancaster County as well. With respect to the declaration or the moratorium, so the Center for Disease and Control issued a moratorium nationwide that would prohibit evictions in certain types of circumstances. And generally speaking, those circumstances were primarily evictions brought as because tenants were unable to pay rent. Okay, so there are lots of exceptions to the moratorium, and tenants, or excuse me, landlords were able to file evictions in a lot of those cases, just could not proceed with evictions in cases where it was for non-payment of rent.
Right. So when we talk about the fact that there was supposed to be no evictions and yet there were continuing evictions is the issue, right? So what we want our audience to understand is that we heard in the news that there were not supposed to be evictions, that there was a moratorium, and yet those things continued. And specifically during a pandemic, when we're telling people you have to stay home, please don't go out. And then we're also saying, but you're going to be evicted from your home. So I think that is important for our listeners to understand. Now, Gabriella is the director and filmmaker of a film called Behind in Rent, and that's the issue that we're talking about today. And so I'm going to ask Gabriella to tell us a little bit more about her film. And specifically, Gabriella, what moved you to do this film? What were some of the most important stories that you came out of it? And also, what would you like us to know about what you learned from the people that you interviewed?
Thanks, Kathy, for having me this morning. It's great to be here with such familiar faces and friends and colleagues who've worked on this issue together. So about last year around this time, when the pandemic started to really change the everyday reality here in Lincoln and Lancaster County, I had already been kind of cued in and a part of conversations happening around housing justice here in Lincoln for the past several years. And as a filmmaker and journalist have been covering housing justice and housing affordability, particularly in the south of downtown area, for the past couple of years. And so when the pandemic hit, I was already a part of the network of folks who were, including the folks on this call, who were concerned about what the pandemic would mean for our housing insecure neighbors. And I think as a storyteller for me and just a community member in this neighborhood, I've lived in the near South for the past 8 years. I just felt compelled to turn my lens to the reality I was witnessing my neighbors experiencing. And that kind of just started by going down to the courthouse one day and meeting a woman named Sonia who was facing an eviction that morning. Isabel was there as well. And this was kind of before the Tenants Assistance project had formally started. But people were like Mindy and Ryan Sullivan and others were starting to go to the eviction court and notice that there was a need for legal representation. So Isabel and I ended up at the courthouse just kind of as witnesses to to the specific case that this woman was facing in early March of 2020. And she allowed me to interview her and take some photos. And from there, I started to wonder, is there more here to this story that our community needs to know? And so through my, just connections with the South of Downtown Community Development Organization, they approached me about collaborating and working together to create a film that would raise awareness to the issue of evictions in our community. And that was ultimately produced to be on display at the Nebraska History Museum for their exhibit Evicted back in December. And so, ultimately what I think I want people to get from or take away from the film is that, eviction isn't an individual issue. What we see in the film are, yes, the human stories and the unique human circumstances that people are going through when they face an eviction or when they're experiencing housing insecurity. For women particularly, that can look like, being a single mother, being a full-time caretaker for their families. In the case of the pandemic, it looked like losing jobs and losing stability, as well as, interpersonal issues that we were all, I think, facing at that time, in addition to, one woman in the film had just lost her husband, was grieving as a widow. Getting to meet her and her story and hear her circumstances, in addition to another woman in the film, Christy, who's a mother of 3 and had just moved into a house that her kids were able to have their own bedrooms and had kind of really just achieved that stability that she really needed for her family when she faced an eviction. And the Tenants Assistance Project was there to help her stay in her home and stay housed. But getting to witness just someone like Christy, advocating for herself. Of course, it took that legal representation really made a difference in her case, but it was her going above and beyond and fighting for her kids to have the stability that she had worked so hard to achieve for them. That was really eye-opening for me as a community member of the support that is needed for women and families experiencing housing insecurity. So I got to meet with folks from the YWCA who are doing a lot of great work as well. And yeah, ultimately, I hope that people feel compelled to, share the film and understand that, there's so much more to someone's story when they face an eviction. People are working hard and people are doing everything they can. And it's really just the systemic structures that lead to someone, facing an eviction. And so projects like the Tenants Assistance Project are essential in ensuring that we are providing that accountability and that support on the end for a tenant who, in the case of an eviction, has very little power in the court systems.
Thank you, Gab. That is such a great introduction to the idea of the Tenant Assistance Program. And I'm going to ask Lori to talk a little bit more about that, since I know you're sort of the director of that program, right? The Tenant Assistance Program.
So yeah, the Tenant Assistance Project is an impactful eviction defense project that was initiated in Lincoln, Lancaster County, and operates out of the Lancaster County Courthouse 4 days a week when eviction hearings are being held. And so the project itself really launched at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, really through the assistance of Ryan Sullivan, who is a professor at the law school. He works in the clinic, and with the hefty support of Mindy Rush Chipman, they really got this project off of the ground and began talking with a few attorneys who might be interested in volunteering, and then reached out to me at the Volunteer Lawyers Project our main job really is to create and facilitate and manage pro bono opportunities that volunteer attorneys find meaningful, impactful, and rewarding. And so they said, hey, can you help us out here? This is a huge endeavor. We need more than a few attorneys to do this work. And so I gladly joined hands with them. The project itself has evolved. It's now a collaborative effort and includes a lot of organizations, at least 10, probably more. I always seem to miss naming a few of them, but hopefully I get most of them here. So there's legal entities involved, and that's obviously UNL, Civil Legal Clinic, Legal Aid is involved, the Volunteer Lawyers Project at the Nebraska State Bar Association, where I'm at, is involved. And then we have the City of Lincoln and the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights. So Mindy's group plays a vital role here. And then also community partners and community organizations such as Civic Nebraska, south of downtown, the Collective Impact Lincoln, and others. So those are basically the organizations. I'm sure I probably forgot to name a few, but how it generally works is this, and this is really a multifaceted approach. So kind of bear with me. We have our partnering organizations recruiting community volunteers, and community volunteers do two major things that really boost this program. And the first is that they are providing direct targeted outreach to tenants with eviction hearings scheduled. And I can't emphasize this piece enough, and I'll talk later hopefully about some of the successes, but this is one of the successes for sure. These outreach workers are talking with tenants who have hearings scheduled. They are providing them information about resources that might be available, including the Tenant Assistance project available at the courthouse. They are providing some basic education through pamphlets and handbooks about their rights. And they're really encouraging them to attend their hearings and actively participate in their cases. So that's key. The other thing they do is they are there at the courthouse with us helping. They are greeting tenants as they're coming off of the elevator, approaching them, asking them if they need assistance, and if the Tenant Assistance project could be helpful to them. And if so, they then explain the project and have them sign a disclaimer and have them do an intake. So folks who receive this assistance have to be financially qualified for it. The goal is to help low-income people, so they have to do an intake. Then we have VLP, my program, which recruits the volunteer attorneys. So we get volunteer attorneys to show up 4 days a week at the courthouse and provide direct representation to tenants. And that can be legal advice through negotiation with the landlord or their attorney, all the way through contested hearings and trials. We've even had some appeals that have come out of there. So the attorneys are showing up and doing that work. But we also have law students on site. And so Ryan and others from the law school get law students to volunteer. They also provide several critical roles here. The first is probably the creation of what we call eviction defense packets. And so what that is a review of all of the filings in justice, that's the court recordation system, for every hearing that is scheduled, to help basically determine what defenses may be eligible for that tenant, and to put together a copy of all of the pleadings in that case. Those packets are then taken to the courthouse and used by the volunteer attorneys and the law students as they work very quickly with these tenants to try to represent them that day of the hearing. Students are also screening tenants to determine whether there's any potential discrimination or whether a reasonable accommodation is needed. And then they're also sitting in the courtroom and observing. So they're helping track outcomes because the collaborative is gathering data and looking at that data. And then we also have the housing coordinator who is on site at the courthouse. And that person is there to work directly with tenants who owe rent to basically facilitate an application with them to get rental assistance so that we can get the rent into the hands of the landlords to keep those folks housed. So each one of these roles is absolutely vital and critical to really the good work of the collaborative and to keeping people housed in Lancaster County.
Mindy, I'm going to turn to you now then in talking about the city and specifically about what Lori was talking about in the housing assistance. What kind of housing assistance is available in Lincoln? And then specifically, if you could also talk, since you're wearing your Director of Human Rights Commission hat, about perhaps discrimination, what you're seeing as far as women and people of color, that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about your work related to those issues?
Sure, thanks, Kathy. I'll go ahead and start just by pointing out the obvious. Unfortunately, eviction cases often intersect with housing discrimination cases. And we've seen that hold true during the pandemic and unfortunately increase during the pandemic. The benefit of the Commission on Human Rights participating in the Tenant Assistance Project is that we're at the courthouse every day trying to identify folks that might have been subjected to housing discrimination. Whether or not that's the main cause of the eviction action or not, we're here to help and respond in that manner. I know I want to leave time for Isabel. So basically my call to action as far as housing discrimination is that if anyone thinks they've been treated differently in housing, whether it's the denial of their housing or the eviction case itself, denial of a request for a reasonable accommodation, you have 1 year to contact the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights so we can get you pointed in the right direction and investigate whether or not that act was illegal and try to get some recourse in that manner. I think the most important reason that I'm here is to really just push out information about the Lincoln Housing and Utility Assistance Program. The City of Lincoln's received $13 million. We're on track to receive more money specifically designated to provide Lincoln community members help paying their rent and also paying their utilities. In Lincoln, we're really lucky to have a lot of organizations doing this work to help distribute these funds to people who need to use the funds right away. Recently, we've created a portal where everybody can go like a one-stop shop type of location instead of trying to figure out which different agencies to respond to. And that it's a city website. It's just lincoln.ne.gov/rent. There's an online application that's going to be available in different languages soon, but there's also a phone number that can be called and we can connect with interpreters in many different languages. And that phone number is 402-413-2085. So I think if you take nothing else from my information here today, Kathy, is just that the city has money to connect community members with help paying their rent, with help paying their utilities. And the sooner we can work with community members, the better. Like Lori said, there's a member from my team that's at the courthouse. Every day there's eviction hearings trying to connect people with help to pay their rent. But let's try to connect to them sooner before they actually have to show up at an eviction hearing. So if we can all just push out that information to our community members, it would be super helpful to try to prevent what Gab's displayed in her video, which is not just detrimental to those families, but our community as a whole.
So Isabel, let's ask you to talk a little bit more about some personal experiences perhaps you've had, because I think it's important for us to realize, as Gab mentioned, that these are individuals, these are people. We have statistics, we have these things, and we talk about programs, but these are real people who are dealing with issues that some of them thought they never would have to deal with. So could you talk a little bit in your work with the South of Downtown organization and some things that you'd like our viewers to know?
I'm just really happy to be part of this powerhouse team of awesome people who are working on this issue. Gabs, Mindy, and Lori, I super admire. And this is all just recognizing that it takes a whole community to fix issues like this. And so part of what we do at the South of Downtown Community Development Organization is doing a lot of really intensive listening with our neighbors and knocking on doors. And so eviction is not an issue that just has happened over the past year due to the pandemic. It was already existing because of the way that our housing system is and the way that our wages are. There's just a bunch of different issues that compound that tie into the the very basis of our life, which is this stable housing. So I believe that housing is a human right, because without it, a lot of folks are left vulnerable to a lot of different things that could happen. Having that stability is really core and essential to a person's success in life and their quality of life. And so as we were going through the pandemic, we were realizing that people were losing their jobs, especially within our focus area, which is from 9th to 17th and K to A streets. A lot of folks have jobs in the service industry, and they live here because it's easy for them to get to work downtown. It's easy for them to hop on a bus because we're close to all the transit lines. And we were seeing this, and we were anticipating this influx of evictions, which was happening shortly after that. And what we found out was the way to go is a multifaceted approach. So knocking on the doors, getting in touch with the Tenant Assistance project and formalizing that, getting the support of the city. Thankfully, we've got that, and we've got funding for Mindy's colleague Josh to help out and be at the courthouse. And then there's a lot of other things that we did too. So we were looking at policy issues and what is it within our legal framework that allows this to be perpetuated even when our everyone is saying stay home. And that was the thing that I was really passionate about, is this policy, because I believe that the personal is political and the political is personal, because our Landlord-Tenant Act is directly affecting the way that our rental system functions. And so one really exciting thing that's happened in the past year is that several senators have introduced housing legislation to modify the Landlord-Tenant Act to allow for more flexibility. And there were 6 of these bills that were packaged into LB 320, which just passed from general file to select file yesterday, which is super exciting. And one of the things that is folded into there is this thing about a continuance. And so what we were seeing at the courthouse was that folks weren't able to get a continuance because in Nebraska statute, it is the only kind of court case that you cannot get a continuance for unless you have extraordinary cause. And what I've heard in the past from my colleagues at Legal Aid is that this can even include someone being hospitalized. Someone being hospitalized was not enough of an extraordinary cause for them to be able to move their court date. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about is that the statutes the legislation is proposing to change them so that it's only requiring a good cause, which would be a hospitalization, someone having COVID, inability to get there, all of these different things. And so this is basically the reason that we were given that we could not stop all evictions because these needed to happen within our state statute between the 10 to 14 days. And having this good cause continuance, while it might not seem like a big deal to change a word from extraordinary to good, it does so much for the folks who are facing eviction. Even just being at the courthouse, like Lori and Mindy were saying, makes such a dramatic effect on the outcome. Before the tap and before we were doing outreach with folks just weren't showing up to the courthouse. And now knocking on doors, getting people to show up and saying, hey, there's someone here for you. There's someone here to reach an agreement, get you more time to move out, get you money in so that you can stay in your apartment, or get money to pay your back rent. All of that is there now. And it's been so amazing to see the transformation in the balance of power. We're riding the scales a little bit now with the Tenant Assistance project and with the policy, with sharing the stories. Everything is just coming together, and it's really been a multifaceted effort to help people facing eviction in our community.
Well, thank you so much. I really think that this has been a really important way for us to get this information to the viewers, to let people know what's really happening. I think the word eviction elicits a different feeling from everyone, but what's important is as all of you have said, these are individuals, but it's also a systemic issue. And so it's important for us to let people know that one thing that has really impacted women and people in our community is this idea of losing their homes. And so we thank all of you for being part of this today. And again, thanks for all of your efforts for everyone in our community.